The morning it happened started like every other Friday. I straightened the knot of my tie in the restroom mirror and waited for the copier to finish warming up. The office lights hummed softly overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a phone kept ringing and no one picked it up. Gerald cleared his throat behind his desk and folded his hands together like he was about to deliver bad medical news. "I know this might come as a surprise," he said, keeping his voice low and careful. "But Caleb brings fresh energy, new perspectives." I didn't say anything right away. I just nodded once. "You understand, right?" he added. "It's nothing personal." I looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Gerald was in his early 50s, neatly pressed shirt, thinning hair combed with intent. He'd inherited the department years earlier when his father-in-law stepped aside. That detail had always lingered quietly in the background. "I understand," I said. He exhaled, relieved. "Good. I knew you'd be professional about this. That's why you're such a valuable member of the team." Valuable. Not valuable enough for the role I'd been preparing for, but valuable enough to train the person who got it instead. I walked back to my desk and sat down. The floor settled into its usual rhythm, keyboards tapping, printers cycling, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the break room. I opened my laptop and stared at the screen longer than I meant to. I joined Ridgeway Industrial in early 2020, not long after my divorce finalized. I was 43 and needed stability more than inspiration. Manufacturing logistics wasn't exciting work, but it was predictable. Shipments, schedules, contracts, things that either lined up or didn't. Gerald had hired me himself, shook my hand, and said they needed someone steady, someone who knew how to keep clients calm when things went sideways. "We're growing fast," he'd said back then. "Plenty of room to move up if you do the work." So I did. I stayed late when deliveries got stuck outside El Paso, worked weekends smoothing over supplier disputes from Tucson to Dallas, built relationships that didn't live in spreadsheets but in people's phones. My reviews were always clean, no complaints, no missed targets. Whenever promotions came up, Gerald would smile and say, "You're management material, just need patience." I had patience. My daughter, Emma, stayed with me every other weekend. She was 15 now, old enough to notice when I answered emails at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings. "Dad, it's the weekend," she'd say. "I know," I'd tell her. "Just tying up loose ends." Her mother had remarried someone with normal hours and dinner routines. I was the dependable one in different ways. I never missed recitals, never forgot birthdays. I just worked more than I should have. The first shift happened about 6 months earlier when Gerald mentioned his nephew might be joining the company. "Sharp kid," he said casually. "Just finished school." I didn't think much of it. New graduates came through all the time. But Caleb didn't start at the bottom. He started in the office next to Gerald's, with a title that didn't explain much and a salary no one talked about. He sat in on my calls, took notes while I explained contracts, asked questions that told me he hadn't seen the inside of a supply chain before. Still, he was polite, eager. He said thank you. So I trained him. That was my job. I didn't know then that 3 weeks later, I'd be standing in a quiet hallway after hours, listening to a conversation that wasn't meant for me, holding a paper cup of cold coffee, realizing my future had already been decided. I closed my laptop and rested my hands on the desk. Then I waited. The hallway outside Gerald's office carried sound more than people realized. It was late. The cleaning crew had already finished our floor, and the building felt hollow in that way offices do after dark. My footsteps had softened out of habit. I'd learned long ago how to move without drawing attention. I was heading toward the break room when I heard Gerald's voice through the crack of his door. "The board's going to ask questions," he said. Another voice answered him, older, measured, someone from corporate. I recognized it as Mark Reynolds, one of the regional directors who flew in once a quarter and never remembered names. "He's only been here 2 months, Mark said. "You told us Daniel was ready." "Daniel is solid," Gerald replied. "Reliable, but Caleb's family, and he's got the degree. The board likes degrees." There was a pause. I stood still, my hand resting on the paper cup. "What about Daniel's experience?" Mark asked. Gerald laughed softly. Not cruel, just dismissive. He's good at what he does, Gerald said. But he's not executive material. He'll keep running operations, make decent money, and everything stays stable. I remember noticing how calm his voice sounded when he said it, like the matter had already been settled weeks ago. He won't cause issues? Mark asked. No, Gerald said without hesitation. He's got responsibilities, a kid, mortgage. He needs the job. He'll fall in line. I stood there longer than I should have, long enough for the words to settle into something solid. They weren't angry words or careless ones. They were practical. I walked away before either of them opened the door. At my desk, I saved my reports, shut down my computer, and drove home without turning on the radio. The streets were empty. Traffic lights changed for no one. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying Gerald's tone in my head. Not what he said, but how certain he was. He'll fall in line. I thought about Emma, about how she'd told her friends I might be moving into a leadership role, about the way she'd smiled when I said things were finally lining up. I also thought about my ex-wife's voice from years earlier. Calm, frustrated. You let people decide your limits for you, she'd said. One day you're going to wake up and realize you agreed to a life you didn't choose. At the time, I'd brushed it off. I believed patience was strength. The next morning, I came in early, earlier than usual. The office smelled like fresh carpet cleaner and burnt toast from someone's breakfast sandwich. I watched Caleb more closely that day. I noticed how Gerald pulled him into meetings I'd been excluded from, how decisions I'd normally handle quietly landed on Caleb's desk first, how people started checking with him before finalizing things I'd managed for years. 3 weeks later, we sat in the conference room while Gerald congratulated Caleb on his promotion. Applause filled the room, polite, controlled. I clapped too, not because I was angry, not because I was hurt, because something had gone very still inside me. That afternoon, I returned to my desk, opened a blank document, and stared at the cursor blinking back at me. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed even. At exactly 4:30 p.m. on Friday, I printed 2 pages, folded them carefully, and placed them in an envelope. Gerald was walking Caleb through the warehouse when I knocked on his door. I need a moment, I said. He smiled, still confident, still certain. I handed him the envelope and said, "This is my 2 weeks' notice." Then I waited. Gerald didn't open the envelope right away. He looked at it like it might explain itself if he waited long enough. Then he tore it open and scanned the page, his eyes moving faster with each line. "Is this a joke?" he asked. "No," I said. He leaned back in his chair. "You're quitting because Caleb got the promotion." I stayed quiet. Gerald stood and began pacing behind his desk. "Daniel, let's be reasonable. You're upset, I get that. But walking away from 5 years here? That's not smart. I've made my decision." He stopped pacing and looked at me more directly. "What about your daughter, your responsibilities?" There it was, the assumption he'd already said out loud to someone else. "I'll manage," I said. His tone shifted, firmer, sharper. "You realize how this looks, right? Quitting because you didn't get promoted. It's unprofessional." I nodded once. "I can see how you'd think that." He frowned. "I won't be able to give you a reference if you leave like this. No company wants someone who walks out when things don't go his way." I noticed how calm the room felt. No ringing phones, no footsteps outside, just the hum of the vents. "That's your choice," I said. Gerald tried again, softer this time. "Look, I like you. You're good at what you do, but Caleb brings something different. Vision, energy." "Vision," I repeated. "Yes, the board wants innovation. He represents the future." "And I represent what?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. "Experience," he said. "Stability." I nodded. "I'll finish my 2 weeks." His eyes narrowed. "You're still going to train him?" "He needs to understand the contracts, the vendor escalation paths, emergency protocols." "Don't expect any favors," Gerald said. "You're burning bridges." "I understand." As I turned to leave, he called after me. "You're making a mistake." I stopped at the door. "Maybe, but it's mine. Walking back to my desk, I felt lighter than I had in months. Most of the office had already cleared out. Caleb was still there, staring at organizational charts like they might answer him. I sat down and opened a new document. I started writing everything he'd need: vendor contacts, backup suppliers, notes on clients who preferred phone calls over emails, not because Gerald asked me to, but because systems matter more than egos. My phone buzzed. A message from Emma. "Can we get dinner tomorrow? I want to hear about your week." I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. I've got news." Monday morning came faster than I expected. I arrived early, as usual, and found Caleb already at his desk. 3 monitors lit up his face. His shoulders were tense. "Morning," I said. He looked up, relief flooding his expression. "Thank God. I've been here since 6. The Morrison account is threatening to cancel." That caught my attention. "What's the issue?" I asked. "Something about delayed shipments from Tucson. I can't tell which supplier it is. The contracts all look the same." I glanced at his screen. He wasn't even in the right files. I pulled up a chair. "Let's start from the beginning," I said. 3 hours later, the issue was resolved. The call was made. The delay rerouted. Caleb leaned back, quiet for a moment. I didn't realize how complex this was. "It builds over time," I said. "Did Gerald show you all this before?" he asked. "No," he admitted. "He said you'd handle the transition." That was the moment I understood something important. Caleb hadn't been set up to succeed, and Gerald didn't understand the job nearly as well as he thought. At lunch, I made a call, then another. By the end of the day, I was listening to the same concern from different voices, different cities, and for the first time, I could see exactly what would happen after I left. I closed my notebook. Then I waited. By Tuesday morning, the pattern was clear. The calls came in waves, spaced just far enough apart that no one upstairs noticed. Procurement managers checking timelines, vendors asking for clarification they'd never needed before. Each conversation followed the same rhythm. Careful questions, long pauses, quiet concern. I didn't give opinions. I didn't warn anyone. I answered exactly what was asked, documented everything, and moved on. At my desk, I stopped thinking in terms of feelings and started thinking in steps. Step 1. Finish my notice cleanly. Step 2. Leave nothing undocumented. Step 3. Don't interfere with outcomes that weren't mine to manage anymore. Silence, I reminded myself, was still a decision. By midweek, Gerald called me into his office again. He looked different, not angry, just tired in a way that came from watching small problems line up instead of disappear. "Maybe we moved too fast," he said. "There's room for compromise." I waited. "You could take an associate director role," he continued. "You'd handle the technical side. Caleb focuses on strategy." Same work, same pay, different label. "That's generous," I said. "But I'll stick with my original plan." His jaw tightened. "You're going to regret this." "Maybe," I said. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a calendar invite, interview, then another, then a third. I hadn't applied anywhere. I hadn't announced anything publicly. I just answered calls honestly for years, and people remembered. Thursday morning, I drove to Austin and shook hands with a regional manager from a competing firm. He didn't ask why I was leaving. He slid an offer across the table and said, "We've been waiting for someone like you to become available." The title matched the one I'd been passed over for. The compensation was higher. The terms were clean. No non-compete. I accepted. Friday afternoon, Gerald summoned me again. Caleb was there too, sitting quietly, his notebook closed. "I hear you've been interviewing," Gerald said. "That's a conflict." "I haven't shared proprietary information," I said. "Your client relationships are proprietary," he snapped. "They're personal," I replied. "I built them." His voice dropped. "Walk out with our clients, and I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." I looked at him steadily. "I'm finishing my notice. What happens after that depends on how this transition is handled." Caleb didn't say a word. My last week was quiet, I documented systems, labeled files, wrote guides that explained not just what to do, but why. On my final day, I turned in my badge. "This isn't over," Gerald said. "For me, it is," I replied. I walked out without looking back. 6 months later, a magazine landed on my desk during a routine meeting. The headline was understated: numbers, percentages, names. I folded it closed, then I went back to work. The magazine stayed folded for the rest of the meeting. We talked through forecasts, staffing timelines, and a warehouse expansion outside San Antonio. Ordinary work, useful work, the kind that moves forward whether anyone notices or not. Afterward, David asked me to stay back. "You don't have to read it," he said, nodding toward the magazine, "but you should know the board's involved now." I already knew. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't saved. I stepped into an empty conference room and closed the door behind me. "Daniel," Gerald said. His voice sounded strained. "We need to talk." "I'm at work," I said. "Make it brief." There was a pause, then a shift in tone. "Things got misunderstood. The investigation is blown out of proportion." "I'm not part of it," I replied. "You were," he said quickly. "You set things in motion." I stayed quiet. "They're saying clients left because of instability," Gerald continued. "Because of you." "I finished my notice," I said. "I documented everything. I trained your team. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine." "You knew what would happen," he snapped. "I knew what was possible," I said. "That's not the same thing." Another pause. Longer this time. "They're asking about conversations," Gerald said. "Things said in confidence." I pictured that hallway, the cracked door, the paper cup cooling in my hand. "I don't discuss private conversations," I said, his voice tightened. "You owe this company loyalty." "I gave it," I replied. "For 5 years." The call ended without goodbye. A week later, confirmation came through channels I wasn't connected to anymore. An internal report, a vote, a termination notice that didn't use his name in the headline, but didn't need to. Caleb resigned shortly after. I didn't feel relief or satisfaction. Mostly, I felt distance. A year later, on a layover in Tucson, I stopped at a diner near the airport, the kind with chipped mugs and laminated menus. I recognized Caleb before he saw me. Older, more settled, a textbook open in front of him. "Mind if I sit?" I asked. He nodded. We talked about school, about learning systems from the ground up, about starting over without shortcuts. "I should have said no," he admitted, "back then." "You didn't know enough to know better," I said. He looked at me steadily. "You deserved that role." "I found a different one," I replied. When the check came, I paid and stood. He thanked me quietly, not for the lunch, for the way I'd handled everything. Outside, the desert air was still. I walked to my gate and waited. The confirmation didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, through numbers and notices that never mentioned me directly. A client transfer request here, a compliance review there, a quarterly report revised and revised again. By the time it became public, the outcome already felt settled. Ridgeway Industrial's regional division lost 3 of its largest accounts within 6 months, not dramatically, just quietly, one renewal cycle at a time. Each decision followed procedure. Each exit notice cited the same language: service instability, leadership inconsistency, operational risk. An internal investigation followed, then another. Gerald was removed from his role before the end of the year. The announcement was short, neutral, no details beyond governance concerns. Caleb's name appeared briefly in an internal memo. Resignation accepted. No further comment. I didn't celebrate. I didn't share the article David had slid across the table. I folded it once, then filed it away with other things that no longer needed attention. At my new firm, the days were steady. Meetings started on time. Decisions were documented. When something broke, the process told us where and why. That was the difference. One afternoon, I received an email from a procurement manager I hadn't spoken to in months. "Just wanted to say the transition has been smooth. Appreciate the clarity." I replied with a single line. Glad to hear it. Nothing more was needed. A few weeks later, another message came in, then another. Former clients, now officially transferred, each followed the same rules. Waiting periods observed, contracts respected, no shortcuts. The system did what systems are supposed to do when they're built honestly. Late one evening, after everyone else had left, I stayed back to organize a shared drive. Old habit. I labeled folders, archived drafts, deleted duplicates. I noticed how little noise there was in my head while I worked. No rehearsed conversations, no second guessing, just tasks completed in order. At home, Emma asked how work was going. It's calm, I told her. She smiled. That's good. It was. I didn't run into Gerald again. I heard later that he'd filed a lawsuit, wrongful termination, breach of understanding. It didn't go far. Caleb finished his graduate program the slow way. Entry-level role, no title that needed explaining. He earned his first promotion 2 years later. I heard that from someone else. By then, my attention was elsewhere. New teams, new systems, people who asked questions because they wanted to understand, not because they wanted leverage. On a quiet Friday afternoon, I closed my laptop, cleaned my desk, and turned off the light. Then I walked out. Not away from anything, just forward. A year later, my mornings looked different. I woke up earlier, not because I had to, but because the house was quiet then. I made coffee, wiped the counter as it brewed, and stood by the window while the sun moved across the street. No emails waiting. No sense that something was about to fall apart if I stepped away. At work, I kept my desk simple. One notebook, one pen, a short list written in pencil that I erased and rewrote every afternoon. When problems came up, we handled them in order. No raised voices, no last-minute rescues that depended on one person carrying everything. On Sundays, Emma and I cooked dinner together. Nothing complicated, pasta, soup, sometimes breakfast for dinner. We talked about school, friends, plans she hadn't figured out yet. I listened more than I spoke. One evening, while organizing old files at home, I came across a printed copy of my resignation letter. I read it once, folded it neatly, and put it back where it belonged. Not as a reminder of what went wrong, but of the moment I stopped waiting for permission. I didn't regret leaving. I didn't regret staying as long as I did, either. Both choices made sense at the time they were made. The difference was knowing when one chapter had ended. Every now and then, someone new would reach out. A manager unsure how to handle pressure from above. A coworker quietly training the person who had just passed them over. The stories were never identical, but the pattern was familiar. I never gave dramatic advice. I asked questions. I suggested writing things down. I reminded them that silence could be intentional, and that systems remember what people try to forget. Most figured it out on their own. That was enough. If this story felt familiar to you, you're not alone. And if you're in the middle of something similar, you don't have to rush your way through it. Clarity comes faster when you slow down and pay attention. If you found this story helpful, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps this channel reach people who might need to hear something steady instead of loud. And if you're watching right now, tell me in the comments what city you're in and what time it is where you are. I read more of those than you might think. 2 more stories will be up next, and they're both about moments when quiet decisions changed everything. Take care of yourself.